Good afternoon. Welcome to this last session, but extremely important of this conference. And if Governor Visco is online, he'll chair the panel, the final panel of this very, very interesting conference. Ignazio?
Yes, just to understand, I suppose that we are not in. There is, I suppose, Michael Greenstone who is missing. Is it correct?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Greenstone is still missing at the moment.
Okay, so we start with a missing panelist, but I think we can cope for the time being with that. I welcome everyone to the closing session of this conference, and as Governor of the Bank of Italy, I'm really glad to moderate a panel discussion about the challenges of net zero policies and the role of finance to spur the transition in light of the coming COP26 meeting in Glasgow. Arresting climate change requires achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale, and this has to take place by mid-century. It is an urgent task, one that somehow, if we don't act now, acting later could be very costly and might turn out to be also ineffective according to many analyses. In July, we had the conference in Venice on climate change that took place under the Italian G20 presidency, and there major global actors were convened, including G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, to discuss the policies and actions needed to achieve the 2015 Paris Agreement goals. Overall, the participants of the conference agreed that climate change poses huge risks to economic resilience, to financial stability, to human well-being. All these are obviously things that we agree very much upon, but really the issue here is enhancing international coordination, which is crucial to support an orderly and just transition at global level. We have seen these increases in gas prices very recently, very huge increases. Energy prices are on the rise, and there is a lot of complaint around the world about this, so the governments are acting to limit that. Now, obviously, we need an orderly transition, but we need a transition, so relative prices have to change. And this issue is really something that is not easy to obtain, and obviously to have everybody agreed upon on it. It is now, however, quite clear that while COP26 is approaching, countries' commitments to reduce emissions and meet the mid-century targets are not enough. The current nationally determined contributions of all the parties involved, 191 countries taken together, imply that by 2030, more than a 15% increase in global greenhouse gas emissions will take place compared to the 45% reduction that is considered to be necessary. Now, a successful transition requires, I think, more ambitious plans, and this has been the discussion on which this conference has been taking place, and certainly more ambitious plans together with closer global cooperation. The presentations that we heard today shed some light on what policies can be considered as optimal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and these without hindering or trying to hinder as little as possible the economic growth prospects at country and global levels. Now, enacting such policy, however, is, as we all know, very difficult. It's not an easy task. And this is so because there are very diverse socio-economic conditions in different countries at the world level, and also the political difficulties that are present and the actual willingness to act that seems to be lacking in a number of countries is something that we have to consider with care. And this takes place especially in those countries that are at an earlier stage of development and whose economies are more dependent on fossil fuels. By the way, fossil fuels are still heavily subsidized, and therefore the actual carbon price, once one takes them into account is very, very low, perhaps even negative. Now, the question is how to align the incentives of these countries with those of the global community. Can a different mix of public policies and market-based mechanisms across countries be effective in supporting emission reduction and investment in green infrastructure and technology innovation? While each country is clearly responsible for putting in place its own mitigation strategy, the issue here is whether there could, how we could get the mutual benefits from policy coordination, which are potentially very large. I would say they're essential. We did not have coordination at the time of Kyoto, and even if we had some plans, we had engineered a market for emissions, permits for emissions and so on, but it did not work globally. So the global coordination is essential. And this is what we discuss in fora like the G20, like the G7, where multiple options for harmonization and collaboration are really considered. But I would say more at the technical level than at the political level. There is a difficulty at the political level that has to be overcome. And in addition, there are various ideas around setting up a club of willing countries. This has been suggested, among others, by Bill Nordhaus, who introduced our meeting in Venice. And the question is whether these proposals are really viable. Now, we will discuss this and other topics with our distinguished speakers. Certainly there will be Gita Gopinath, who is the John Swanstra Professor of International Studies and of Economics at Harvard, and is currently serving as Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund. Michael Greenstone, whom I hope will join us soon, who is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at Chicago, and also a director of the Interdisciplinary Energy Policy Institute there. Klaas, who is president of the Nederlandsche Bank, member of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank, vice chair and upcoming chair of the Financial Stability Board, and last but not least, obviously, Lord Nicholas Stern, who is the IG Panel Professor of Economics and Goldman, chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment, head of the India Observatory at the London School of Economics, and one of the main contributors to the issues already in the early 2000s. We know about the report that you put together, and I remember your words when we had the G20 meeting in China. I think you were connected, and you were saying that at the end, the technology will make it. And so this is also an issue that we may touch upon. So I welcome you all joining now us online. And during this conversation, we profit from your thoughts on how to convert commitments into policy actions, and in particular, how to reap the benefits of acting jointly. And I think that we may start with the first round of questions. We have planned for 25 minutes, more or less. It means 6 minutes each. We'll see whether Michael will join. But I would start with Nick, and then followed by Gita and Klaas. And so this is my first set of questions to Nick. A successful transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy obviously requires a policy framework that is both credible and comprehensive. This is in order to support investments, and those investments I mentioned before, through structural policies that set clear market expectations, including carbon pricing and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies, as well as regulatory measures. Now, what policy framework do we need to achieve a successful transition? And how do you see the roles of both the public and private sectors, as well as the interactions between the two? What are the macroeconomic implications of different approaches, and which approach should you prefer? Obviously, 6 minutes are not enough to answer these questions, but I'm sure that you will give it a try. Thank you, Nick. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The first thing to recognize is, as you underlined, Governor, from the beginning, that the risks we face from inaction are immense, much bigger actually than in standard economic models, which are seen as rather strange by the scientists who help us understand these risks. But the risks are immense, and the time is short. And you underline that, I want to underline it again. The way forward is around investment. And this is actually a special moment in history where not only that our actions are decisive, but we can see that this is a moment where we can identify the investments we have to make. We can recognize their scale and their geography. We have to invest, and I'm sure you saw, Governor, the G7 paper, which we prepared for the UK summit in June. The investments we need to make as a world, about 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP over and above where we are now. And of course, we have to change the composition of investment as well. So this is a moment where the policy question is, how do we stimulate the investments that we need? And we can describe roughly what they are. We're going to learn a lot along the way, but we can describe how to start, both in scale and in nature. That's very different from standard economic analyses in these areas, which will say, get your institutions right, get your prices right, get good governance, and let investment be what it may. The markets will work it out. This is different from that. It's that story is part of the story that we have to follow. Of course it is, because we need the markets to give the incentives. But this is investment with a purpose, investment that we can identify. And the policy question is, how do we generate that investment? Now, that's the large measure, the macro story. Then we move over to the micro and the structural. And we say, what are the key market failures here? How do we understand them? And what are the key absent markets? It's not just market failures, it's also absent markets. The market failures, well, number one is the greenhouse gas externality. Let's always keep that top of the list. But we have 5 other very big market failures, not marginal, not footnotes, central. So there's the research and development story, intense in this context. There's the capital markets in the context of very rapid change. We know that they handle risk only moderately well, to be kind. And there's a situation where the investment story is very strong. There is the whole story of networks, electricity networks, recycling, public transport, absolutely core. And their markets need foundations in order to work. Not necessarily public ownership, but they need foundations. Great deal of information is necessary. Mark Carney's been very strong on that. Consumers need information, so you're going to need quite a lot of regulation around transparency and information. And last but not least is the whole story of what we call co-benefits. Air pollution, much of it from fossil fuels, kills somewhere between 5 and 10 million people a year. The death rate in the world is a bit more than 50 million. This is huge in this story, and with very big macroeconomic consequences. So let's remember that it's not just one market. If we look at the first one, top of the list, the greenhouse gas emissions, let's remember that we live in a world with increasing returns to scale and a lot of uncertainty. Unless you gave up economics after the first year, you would know that price mechanisms with increasing returns to scale and lots of uncertainty don't necessarily do everything for you. They do a lot. We forget the role of the price mechanism at our peril. It's just a mistake in economics to say that economics says that the carbon price is the most efficient way to do it. It's somebody who stopped economics too early. A statement that says carbon price must be at center stage, I think we'd all go along with. But it's uniquely, obviously, the only thing we have to do. It's just dead wrong and very misleading. Absent markets are very important here. We can't buy the technologies that we'd like to buy because we don't know what they are 20 years down the track. We know enough about them now to get on with it and start making our investments. But absent markets are very important. Transacting on the carbon price market 20 years out is not easy to do. Those markets are not there. We know whether we follow von Hayek or Keynes, I hope both, and Schumpeter too, all 3 of them, we know that expectations are fundamental. And so clarity, as far as we can. Governments can't do total commitments, but we can build institutional structures which give us as much reduction in uncertainty as we can. So that's the story of investment and the story of policy to realize it. I haven't got time to go into the financing of that investment, but we live in a world where planned savings is in excess of planned investment. The extra investment that we're describing should be macroeconomically feasible at a global level, but finance is about getting the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time, and the detail of that matters enormously. Finally, let me say something about coordination. We all teach David Ricardo and trade and point out the importance of an integrated world economy, we're right. But there's something here which is so much stronger than that. Expectations. This is about realizing investment. If governments move together and say this is the direction and the scale of investment that we seek, then we all benefit from those coherent expectations, country by country. If we move ahead, we get the economies of scale. The economies of scale here are immense. I mean, who would have thought, 15 years ago, when we did the Stern Review, who would have thought that the cost of solar would come down by a factor of 10, round the cost, clock solar, and outcompete fossil fuels in most countries of the world, and wind also. Scale is a big part of that story, and moving together gives you the scale. And that is also enormously important, not always in our standard models. And of course, these are global public goods, so coordination is crucial. But finally, there's coordination in the world debt markets. Gita lives that, and I'm sure she'll come back on that. But through COVID in particular, but more than that, through this last decade, stress has been building up, particularly on debt for emerging markets and developing countries. Given that this is a story of investment, we have to manage together as a world that debt if the investments in emerging markets and developing countries are going to take place. This is, I've been doing economics, teaching economics for more than half a century now, and I've never been in a situation or seen a situation where collaboration is more important than now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Indeed, you are also the head of the India Observatory. So talking about emerging markets, this is clearly a crucial area of the world. And in our G20 discussions, I think we got good collaboration at the technical level. We were able to restart what the Chinese started, these Sustainable Finance Study Group, and we have been able to transform it into a permanent group. It is co-chair, and this is very interesting because they accepted our proposal by both the China and the US. So we have both the two largest polluters in the world as well as the two largest economies. Putting together at the political level the willingness to act in a cooperative framework is more difficult than at the technical level. And any strains that we have at geopolitical nature really matters. So we have to keep doing and keep saying, but then at a certain point it is essential the response of the population. So this is crucial. Now, going to
can I just say on that particular point, what we have to show, and I believe we can, is that if we get it right, this is the growth story of the 21st century. Discovery, innovation, investment, and not that it's some kind of horse race between environment on the one hand and growth on the other. That argument is developing, and as we show that, then I think we start to change politics. But we have to be able to finance the investment, and for a country like India, low-cost finance on scale is critical, and the international financial institutions will be crucial for that.
Yeah, very well. This is, in fact, Gita, what I would ask you to help us with, because clean energy investment in the developing and emerging economies is only a fifth of the total, but these are the current countries which now have low energy demand. but there are hundreds of millions of people who are still lacking reliable access to modern forms of energy, and they still have low per capita emissions, but they will account for the bulk of emissions growth in the coming decades, unless stronger action is taken to transform their energy systems, using the suggestion Nick gave us also in terms of investment, economies of scale, and the interaction between the two. Now, what do you think are the available options for building a successful strategy to reconcile developments with transition to net zero? Obviously, this is not the only question that you may answer. How can private finance also help? But I'm sure that at IMF you are thinking a lot about this. So if we could give us some light about this thinking, we would be very grateful. Gita.
Thank you, Governor, and happy to give you our thinking on this particular question, more broadly the question of getting to net zero emissions in less than 30 years and the financing needs that would be needed. You know, the kind of change that we need is profound. We're talking about profound sectoral changes. We are trying to transform the world from being one that is still heavily fossil fuel dependent to one that moves towards low carbon energy sources. So the transformation is profound, and the approach we believe is necessary to make the transition happen without having the kind of economic costs that people worry about has to be a comprehensive strategy. So what exactly is that? What we have is what we call is a bit of a three-pronged approach. One prong is one where you have green investments and support for green R&D. The second prong is carbon pricing and transparency on carbon exposures. And the third is measures for a just transition, just as in JUST transition. And by that, I mean just transition, not just within countries, but across countries. So let me come in here and I will speak specifically to your questions on emerging developing economies, but they're very tightly related. So you know, completely not unexpectedly, I agree with what Nick said about the need for green investments. And while carbon pricing is important for getting the relative prices right, you also need to make sure that we have enough supply of clean energy that comes out at affordable prices. And we just recently put out a note for the G20 where we reviewed what these costs would be like, what kinds of numbers are we talking about in terms of investment needs. And what we estimate is that globally, about $6 trillion to $10 trillion in additional, the important word here is additional, global investments are needed in the energy sector. And importantly, you need to be reallocating also whatever investments are currently going on, and these additional investments have to be tilted towards low carbon emission sources. And this is, so we're talking about cumulative 6 to 10% of global GDP over 10 years, right? So this, you know, this is very possible. It can be done, and especially given what we're trying to prevent, this is absolutely crucial. Now the question is, where does this money come from? The 6 to 10 trillion cumulative additional global investments that are needed over the next decade. We are talking about, we estimate that about 30% of that would come from public sources, and including the fiscal packages that are being announced in part of the recovery plans that countries have from COVID-19 pandemic. We are encouraging countries to use this unique opportunity to invest in this green transition. So that's about 30% of the coverage. But then there is the remaining 70% that would be from private sources. And this would require incentivizing that kind of private investment. So what would that take to ensure that you're getting the right levels of private investment that you need? And this will require, in our view, one, of course, predictability in terms of the regulation and the pricing that you're going to put in place, predictability on carbon pricing, because that provides market signals about the direction in which subsectors are headed. But we also need what we call a climate information architecture, which is missing and woefully inadequate at this point. So carbon pricing provides the incentives to reallocate resources from high to low carbon activities and to improve energy efficiency. But at the same time, to steer the finance towards these sustainable investments, you need just greater transparency. You need this climate information architecture. And that requires three things. One, you just need high quality data, which is reliable, comparable across countries. You need, secondly, a globally harmonized and consistent set of climate disclosure standards. And third, you need globally agreed upon principles for climate finance taxonomies and other classification approaches to align investments with climate goals. So we need a coordination that Nick mentioned in multiple dimensions. And then lastly, on the just transition policies, we do talk about the kinds of income transfer schemes that will be needed to make sure that the most vulnerable are not affected by the transition. But here I'm going to focus on the cross-country dimension, which is basically making sure that there is enough financing for low-income countries to undertake climate mitigation policies, but also in the interim climate adaptation policies that they will need. And so much more needs to be done on that front. It's been woefully inadequate. It will require advanced economies to live up to their commitments to deliver $100 billion a year in climate finance. And also importantly, a significant portion of that climate financing will have to be in the form of grant financing, given that many countries have very elevated levels of debt and are already in debt distress. At the IMF, we are investing, we are building up a resilience and sustainability trust. We are in the process of building such a trust, and which will basically involve countries, some countries with very comfortable external positions, rechanneling their special drawing rights towards this trust to support these kinds of transition, including the green transition. From an emerging developing economies perspective, it will require more than just finance. It will also require technology transfers to make sure that they're able to do the necessary investments that they need. And the question is, what you said is absolutely right. They are growing economies, they have growing energy needs, and so the trade-offs might seem much more starker. But at the same time, there are two things that are working why this is the right time to make the switch. One is that alternative energy fuels renewable energy has become much more cost competitive with fossil fuel sources. And so therefore, this could be the opportunity to just leapfrog towards newer, cleaner, and less polluting energy sources. And so therefore, you can use this as an opportunity for development to make that investment to transition to this. The second is that many of these countries suffer from the problems of bad air pollution, and which is then affecting their health, their morbidity, their mortality. So there are significant benefits, the core benefits, again, as Nick mentioned, that should be particularly salient to these countries. But again, just to combine the whole piece, which is that they will need the financing, they will need the technology transfers, and all the different earlier points I made about making sure that they have access to this kind of financing is absolutely critical.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have, obviously, the challenge is large. Also, the financing is very relevant, even if manageable, as Gita said. How much of this could come from the central banks? I suppose that those who have the legitimacy to act are national governments. They are the ones who can somehow provide the incentives that Nick mentions to investment, the financing also to the developing countries and perhaps some emerging economies that would be needed in the 100 billion plan that Gita was mentioning. And obviously they can do something themselves in carbon pricing and the like, regulation. But there is somehow a lively debate, Klaas, we are engaged in that almost daily, on how central banks and supervisory authorities could integrate the impact of climate change and climate policies into their strategies. We heard, you were not there, Monika Piazzesi complaining about what we do at the ECB, saying that we perhaps are too much obsessed with market neutrality, and in this way we do not favor green industry. There might be something on that. I would not differently than others. I don't think that QE has encouraged debt emissions, public debt, which are at the end, through general equilibrium effect, had the results that Monika was mentioning. But this is an issue. And also supervisors are asked to ensure that the risks are properly accounted for by financial intermediaries. So the question to you is clearly what central banks and supervisors role can play in practice, and especially in the light of your experience at the DNB, perhaps you may help us in making progress on that. Klaas, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ignazio. And I did pick up the last 10 minutes of the debate before the break, so I heard the comment on buying equities and other things that possibly we could do. Well, I won't comment on that, but let me just try to confine my comments primarily here to what actually climate change might mean for financial stability. I mean, by now we are very much aware that it can potentially threaten financial stability. It'll impact the economy as a whole. And I believe with the COP26 now in view, there is clearly strong momentum to act on this. Just to illustrate the momentum, last week we were all in DC, and I think climate change was also there top of mind at the IMF World Bank annual meetings. I had the privilege of presenting the so-called early warning exercise. The title of my exercise was When Tomorrow Becomes Today. And it was mainly about sort of what could happen to the global economy if climate change were to accelerate, if policymakers were to become behind the curve, and then all of a sudden would have to step up their mitigation activities in a way that would be much more abrupt and much more shock-wise than a smooth transition would be. Well, it is pretty clear that that can have quite lasting and quite substantial impact on growth, on financial stability, and what have you. So there is a strong urgency here to act, and I think that should be pretty clear. It's interesting that thinking through the transmission of such a shock, it also reveals that there is actually a lot that we don't know. How specifically, for instance, climate change will impact our financial sector, how specifically the impact will be on the economy. There are some things that we do understand, but there are also some things that perhaps we don't understand yet. It will change relative prices, absolutely, and therefore it'll likely change the volatility of inflation. But will it also lead to higher inflation? That I think is still a question that is out there. So also in that context, I think the topic of this conference is pretty apt. It's good that we focus now on research, on the things that we can do to grasp a better understanding of the macro impacts. And I believe a lot of work that is done in the academic world here is also indispensable to that extent. Now, what we have been doing at DNB, I can give you a few highlights. I mean, already in 2017, we did a sort of test which to what extent institutions in the Netherlands would be exposed to physical risks. You know that large part of my country is below sea level. And climate change is, of course, going to affect the torrential downpours of rains, the sea level itself, etc. And then we moved on by embedding such risks also in what we call macroprudential research. We did a top-down stress test, which, for instance, demonstrated that if we are too late with acting, that for the Dutch financial system, losses could amount between some 48 and 159 billion. Which is quite a sizable amount if you compare that to the amount of capital held in the industry. So there's a lot we still don't know. There's a lot that we do know. I completely agree with, but I think it is indispensable to get the relative prices right and let the market actually do the bulk of the adjustment for us. We have looked specifically at DME also at the impact of the Fit for 55 plans that the Commission has issued. We looked at the competitiveness consequences, the potential competitiveness consequences of that. There's a lot of concern also within the Dutch corporate sector, but we believe that as long as the proceeds are channeled back in a productive way, that the effects on competitiveness can be limited. And of course, also a carbon border adjustment mechanism might further mitigate the negative effects on competitiveness in the industries that are relatively hard hit. Now, to your specific question, where does it sort of specifically impact on central bank tasks and mandates? Well, inflation, I already mentioned, but I also think that there's the broader question on the economy at large, where central banks, even if they are not responsible themselves for activating certain instruments, what we can actually offer is a bit of thought leadership. I think we have a significant amount of staff, research staff, that can actually look into these issues, and very often the governments that sort of avail themselves of these instruments do not have the same analytical capacities to do policy-related research. So jointly with the academic world, again, that's why I think this conference is very well suited. But together with the academic world, I think there's a lot that central banks can do there, even though we do not have an explicit climate objective, but it does touch upon various parts of our mandate. Financial sector, I think disclosures are absolutely key. We need to get this pricing right, this price exploration phase that we have to go through. So a lot more information will have to be disclosed. Well, the financial sector, I think, is key in allocating capital flows, but it's also key when it comes to disclosures. And I'm very glad to see that we are now working from the FSB side, also with the ISSB, which is a branch of the IFRS, to build a global set of consistent and coherent and comparable disclosures. I think that will be absolutely a key element in this sort of early phases of what we need to do. Well, at the ECB, we will also incorporate climate-related risks into our financial instruments, into our own financial risk management, so the protection of the ECB's balance sheet. Of course, we are engaged in a lot of financial transactions with counterparts, where collateral issues, etc., play a role. Ratings that we believe should also better take into account climate-related financial risks. And finally, I could also mention that, for instance, at DNB, when it comes to our own reserves, of course, we have to practice what we preach. We have to align our own reserves with the international sustainability goals and the corporate social responsibility standards. At DNB, we are building a portfolio of green bonds, and we're also investigating whether we can have our equity portfolio also be guided by explicit carbon reduction targets. So that, I think, is a snapshot of what we are doing and what I believe we can do from the central banking side.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Klaas. Obviously, this is what we should do, not only, and many of us are doing it. Our balance sheet now is really very much green as far as our own funds are concerned. Obviously, disclosures will be essential. IFRS accounting will certainly be crucial, and there will be a need to improve on the on the ESG scores that clearly are still very much deficient up to now. We are doing research, working on this, trying to account for the changes, the difference, and so on. And this is in the roadmap of both the FSB and the Sustainable Finance Working Group. So I'm very optimistic on this side. I think this is something we are making clear progress. It will go to the G20 leaders. It goes in the COP26. This is something that helps clearly also the financing of these enterprises or corporations to somehow be directed in a particular way, and all this is good. But there is certainly an issue which I think we should take into account, and the issue has to do with the fact that relative prices of fossil energy versus renewable one will necessarily have to rise. And the question to me is how large, and obviously I'd like you to share that and provide some answers, is how large and widespread do you think the risk of social discontent might be? And by which policy measures could it be contained at both national and global level? What are the risks that transition may be less orderly than we hope? How to make really the private sector to be a willing partner of national governments? Klaas mentioned this early warning exercise. It focused on the tail risk, extreme tail risk, that we may have to consider if there was a, I would say, global catastrophe. But you know, my impression is that these climate change effects are extremely dangerous, but they are not harmonized. It is not nothing like the global financial crisis or the pandemics. They touch they somehow touch all of us in different ways at different times. And so to have a social response like the one we had, for example, in the last couple of years, is not easy to engineer. So the question is how to make these, how to somehow, this we discussed this at the G7 very much in Washington, how to somehow provide with the proper information that would convince most of the population at the global level really to understand the need for going in that direction. I mean, I understand that Gita said very clearly, these 100 billion, please use them, rather than keep saying that they are there to be used. But another question is also whether we have enough information about different progress by different countries. We are talking about carbon pricing. We have explicit carbon pricing, but we can also produce figures of the implicit carbon pricing. How did that be possible? Could we move in that direction? So who wants to speak first? I don't know, Gita.
You know, I think this is an absolutely critical point, which is, can we get this all to work politically? And at a time when energy prices are spiking, I think it's become even more salient. This is, I mean, it's for sure, this is a difficult question, a difficult way to solve it. But our view, of course, has been the following, which is that one, that sequencing is important. What does that mean? That means that when you are raising carbon prices, it would be good to have a predictable path where you're backloading the increase in carbon prices to some extent, while using the near term to ramp up supply of renewable sources of energy, and also the needed investment to get better storage technology, so this becomes a much more resilient source of supply. So that when the actual true carbon price kicks in, it's a great signaling device for people to invest now. But for those who have to actually pay the price in the future, by then you have these alternative sources that makes the switch easier too. So sequencing is one important part. The second is this will require transfers. There's no doubt about it. So you're going to increase your revenues through carbon prices. then you also need a system where you can transfer this back to those who will be deeply affected by it, and especially to vulnerable households. So those kinds of transfers, and you're seeing that in multiple countries actually, where they are raising carbon pricing on one hand, at the same time, say, cutting income taxes for some section of the population or making transfers to it. So you see that happening. Now, despite all of this, you might still have the concerns that carbon pricing doesn't work, in which case there are some alternatives, like you said, which is regulations, so-called rebates, which is that you tax those who on average have higher emissions and rebate it back to those who have lower emissions. So those might be more politically feasible, and that's certainly another approach that we have to take. All of this also becomes a whole lot simpler if for countries in the world, financing is just available more easily to deal with, with these kinds of transition risks.
Thank you very much. Obviously, every time that we talk about transfers at the international level, we have someone who points out to moral hazard and how to cope with the moral hazard that somehow is behind all the support that we may provide to countries hit by crisis, or to, in this case, to countries which do not have the means really to act. But I understand this is an issue that has to be dealt with at the political more than at economic level. Nick, you may join perhaps.
Thank you. So how do we get political buy-in to something that makes enormous sense from the point of view of the cost of inaction being far bigger than the cost of action, something that could well be, should be, if we do it well, the growth story of the 21st century, investing in the technologies of this century, not in the technologies of last century. How do we mobilize political support behind that, given that the transition is complicated, given that there'll be dislocation, market prices, and of course in the activities of people? Well, I think the first thing is to insist on the growth story. And we've started to move in public discussion away from the horse race that I described before of environment on the one hand and living standards on the other. So the more we can show that, both analytically, but of course through example, the greater the force behind the story. The second now is, and related to that, is the private sector is telling that story itself. It's showing how it can reduce cost. It's showing how a responsible firm on the whole does better than an irresponsible firm. Now, many of us have the privilege of working in universities. We get older, but the young stay the same age. And they are very well informed. They're pushing very hard. They're not just shouting at us to do something. Our undergraduates at the LSE, and I'm sure at Harvard with Gita and other places, they're actually working on what to do. And they understand what to do. And they know which firms are doing those things. And they know which firms are not. Unilever, transformed under Paul Polman over his 10 years as CEO, gets 2 million job applications a year. They get the best. And all sorts of other reasons. They get the patient capital. They get customers who think. Now, that story of this being a growth story, both at the macro and at the micro level, is increasingly coming from the private sector. So I think they will be very important actors in that. Thirdly, we can bring costs down through using standards. Let's not make the mistake of only carbon price. Let's not make the mistake of marginalizing the carbon price. The carbon price has to be center stage. But let's not make the mistake of only carbon price. In Europe, Ignazio, as we all know, we banned the incandescent light bulb. It was a monumentally inefficient way of lighting. We banned it, and very quickly alternatives came through. This is not picking winners, it's spotting disastrous risks. And if we act on those disastrous risks, with the knowledge that there's quite a lot of things out there, but let the market work out what the alternatives are, we find that we come up with things very quickly. Same with CFCs, so many examples where actually standards in a world where we have increasing returns to scale and big risk are part of an efficient response because they reduce uncertainty about going to scale. Similarly for, in the UK, like many other countries, you won't be able to sell an internal combustion engine car after 2030. That actually is part of an efficient package along with carbon pricing in order to create the confidence that we need for the investment which is at the heart of this story. So that brings down cost. But also, and I'm right with both Klaas and Gita have said, and I've pushed it very hard myself, is go for things like carbon tax, which have revenue, and then use that revenue to protect people who, over the shorter term, would be hit harder by the price increase. That is a very important part of the story. The international story of equity is in large measure about low-cost capital. We used to say low-cost capital and technology transfer. Technology transfer is still relevant, but it's actually quite remarkable how the availability of those technologies has opened up around the world. India is an innovator in low-carbon cement. India has actually played a big role in driving down the cost of LED light bulbs. India has now got so many examples of round-the-clock solar coming in cheaper than fossil fuel electricity. So for me, center stage for getting the job done in terms of investment, center stage for getting the job done in terms of equity is low-cost finance for developing emerging market countries. That's at the heart of the story. That's why the IFIs are so important in all this, and why bilateral support is important too.
Thank you, Nick. I think that you touched also an interesting point when you mentioned the fact that in the population there is a large share of young people who now is very much willing to go in that direction. There is also some older persons like the Queen of England who is asking why we do not act. And I think this is a nice connection. I wonder whether Professor Greenstone is connected at least on the phone. Because
Hi, I managed to join on the phone.
Yeah.
We had a crackerjack team of 5 or 6 people from the Bank of Italy and 3 or 4 people here, and we gave up, and now we're on the phone. So.
Okay, anyway, you are there, so I may raise a question to you that we have been discussing also the social costs of in not acting. And you have underlined many times how useful it is to use the social cost of carbon as an informative tool for policymakers as a proxy of the cost for inaction. So how do you see the possibility of making regular comparisons between the social cost of carbon and the current carbon rates, including both implicit as well as explicit prices across countries? Could this help policymakers, decision makers, but also the market, the private firms, to make their policy more consistent with their climate targets? The idea of trying to somehow combine the two is really behind much of the suggestions that we are discussing at the G20 level. Maybe you could give us some views on that, and then we can move to Klaas. Michael, please.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It's my great pleasure to join, if only by audio. And of course, it's such an honor to be on this panel with people I admire so much. So I would just back up, and I hope this is not disruptive to where it sounds like you guys are having a very productive conversation. And what I wanted to say, and I will say it somewhat provocatively, is that, of course, climate change is a critical threat for us and for the planet. But I think in order to tackle it, it is actually best framed not just as a climate challenge, but I like to think of it as the global energy challenge. And I think of the global energy challenge as kind of think of it as a stool that has three legs. The first leg, and this is the slightly provocative part, is that every society, and it's going to look very different if you're sitting in London or if you're sitting in Mumbai or if you're sitting in Moscow, every society around the world is extraordinarily focused on how to make sure they have access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy, and that the inexpensive and reliable energy has unlocked such amazing gains in income around the world over the last few centuries. And so I think of that as one leg of the stool. But the other two legs are that the way we have constructed energy markets have basically allowed two other issues to enter, two environmental issues. One is you can think of as local environmental pollutants like air pollution, which is reducing the life expectancy of the average person on the planet by more than 2 years currently. And then the third, of course, is why we're here, which is the same fossil fuels that societies have relied on are increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. And I think, and so the reason I want to back up and frame it like that is, I think if you only look at the climate part and don't think about how different societies, and people are going to see it very differently where they are trying to balance between those three goals, we're going to end up in a place where we're not really communicating well with the different parts of the world. And you're beginning, and that has become, I think, it's painfully obvious in where I do a lot of my work in the state of Bihar in India, where the average person in Bihar consumes about 200 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. In the United States, it's like 13,000. You're also seeing it in very wealthy places like Europe right now, where there's lots of outrage about high energy prices. And so I think it is unwise to talk about climate without seeing that whole picture and trying to figure out a way to balance between those three goals and the various trade-offs. So now let me just turn to actually what you asked me to talk about, which is the social cost of carbon. I like to refer to that as the most important number that you've never heard of. And what the social cost of carbon is, probably in this audience is not necessary, but I'll just repeat it. It's the monetary value of the avoided damages, or say of the damages of releasing an additional ton of CO2. And I think basically every policy that we have relative to the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere, or the 30 to 5 or 40 billion tons of CO2 emitted across the planet currently is marginal. So it's a super useful concept. And I think it is a great focal point for where carbon taxes should be. It's a great focal point for policies that are not carbon pricing. I think they need to be evaluated on their cost per ton. And if they end up being more than the social cost of carbon, then I think they need to be scrutinized very carefully. And if they end up costing less, then that's terrific, and we should do them. And so having a reliable social cost of carbon, I think, is very valuable in kind of guiding climate policy. I think you were also asking about organizations, corporations. It can also be very useful to them. I think what we're seeing, this was probably, if we had this 1 year ago, we would not have been able to say this. But today, I think we can say the demand for voluntary action is really growing by leaps and bounds around the world. And corporations are looking for guideposts on how to judge how much they should be doing. And I think the social cost of carbon is an excellent guidepost for that. So I think it's kind of a North Star of where we should be headed. It affects carbon. It's a guide for carbon pricing. It's a guide for policies that are not carbon pricing for when they're more expensive than we might like them to be. And it can be useful for voluntary actions as well. But
thank you very much.
I think that's, yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Really, on the last part, we have had some discussion on the issue of trying to have better evaluation of the cost per ton and so on. I think this is very much in the making. I think both the OECD, but also the IMF and other international organizations are trying to put together the gaps, to fill the gaps that we have on all these. Klaas, do you want to say something on this issue also?
Yeah, thank you, Ignazio. I just wanted to come back to the social discontent, because I do think that is something that we need not underestimate. And I think, I guess this is another perspective to reiterate what I also said before, that the issue of timing and sort of an early start is really crucial here. Because I think the amount of social discontent could be sizable if we manage the transition very badly. Now, what is a badly managed transition? That's probably a transition which is very shockwise and which will give people the feeling that they have no choice, that they did not have the time to respond and to adapt, etc. And I think that is what the current surge in gas prices is actually a manifestation of. That if you give people, households, businesses the time to move away from fossil fuels to an energy mix that is more based on renewables, then of course, at the end of the day, everybody will understand that the price of fossil fuels will have to go up, and that they will have to go up dramatically, actually. But if they don't, if the time is not there to adjust behavior, then I think this is very much a recipe for public backlash. So the more gradual we can make the transition, and there I think, again, it's up for the governments to set out very clear transition path, so that you provide as much certainty to the private sector also where you want to go. One of the reasons that I'm also hearing that businesses is reluctant to invest in certain green technology is because of, let's say, the unpredictability of the political process. That, okay, we have commitments, we have governments committing to certain targets, but you know, after 4 years, at max, there's another government, and there have been changes in course earlier on, etc. And so predictability and gradualism, I think, is key in managing this well. And that's the only way in which we can continue to have public support. And then the second point, again, tax revenues, to the extent that this brings in new revenues for the governments, this should not be seen as the government increasing taxes on its citizens, but rather these revenues should be put to use in a productive fashion to finance green technologies, to perhaps reduce income taxes for the lower brackets and the lower incomes, etc., and help also the biggest corporates to green their production processes. That can happen at the national level, and then I also agree that at the international level, of course, there is a group of countries, like the advanced countries like mine, which have already filled up their quotum of, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions. Then there is another group of countries which has not done so in the past, but is now being told that it will face identical prices and identical costs because the climate is full and nothing additional can be issued there. Of course, that also sets the stage, I believe, for international solidarity and for some form of transfers also for the rich countries to the poorer economies. And by the way, Ignazio, you mentioned the word moral hazard. In other themes, I've not been shy of using that word, but here I'm not afraid at all that this is such a sort of central theme here. I think we suffer all from climate change, and therefore we just have to help each other and enable also each other to make the transition here. And to the extent that countries cannot do it themselves, well, then of course there needs to be international solidarity, which would probably then also strengthen the resolve of such countries to also do their part.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaas. I agree with that. Obviously, if you use properly the revenues from carbon taxes, clearly this would help. One would also hope that there would be no revenues from carbon taxes if really countries were able to move fast towards renewables and very low carbon emissions. So it is the standard proposition that we have on taxing markets. For example, Tobin tax worked the same way. Now, I would like to move to the third set of our questions in our third round of questions in our discussion before concluding very quickly. And this has to do with the fact that in both the G20 and in the G7, we noted the increased focus of member countries on other environmental, non-climate related topics such as the risk of nature, biodiversity, degradation of the ecosystem, and so on and so on. There has been a Das Gupta report, there has been the OECD who has focused on that, and so on. And this is also what yesterday Professor Heal was mentioning in a very interesting talk. Now, my problem would be really to understand, given that biodiversity and ecosystem degradation are material economic risks, what are the tools that we need to put in place to monitor them? They are very little monitored. But on the other hand, there is really a pressing question about the fact that perhaps the growing focus on this topic may become a distraction that reduces the climate priority on the policy agenda. Is sequencing also here relevant or not? I don't know, Nick, whether you want to say something on this.
Let me start with a bigger picture, then come down to the specifics of biodiversity. We've been talking about a new growth model where investment takes different forms and a way of understanding growth in a broader sense of growth in living standards in a different way. And there, I think, if we think in terms of four forms of capital, physical, human, natural, and social, then I think we start to get a picture of the kinds of investments that we need. We've focused particularly on physical capital here, and that's a huge part of the energy transition. But the human capital, of course, is enormously important in this context, not just in terms of getting the job done of the transition, it does matter there, but also in terms of its contribution to well-being in a very direct sense. But the natural capital story is extremely important. And what we've done broadly as a world is increase our physical capital and our human capital over many decades, whilst at the same time we've been destroying natural capital. And that natural capital is in large measure infrastructure. If you think of infrastructure, the meaning of infrastructure is activities that facilitate investment in activities that facilitate other things that we do that have value. And then in that sense, natural capital is clearly, not all of it, but much of it, a form of infrastructure. In large measure, that how we manage our land and our trees, we restore degraded land, shapes the way in which water flows, the whole water systems in a very profound way. If the Amazon collapses, it's a biodiversity disaster as well as a climatic disaster. So I think we should see this as part of a story and not, as it were, one against the other. A dangerous climate, as the Amazon example is a very clear one, a dangerous climate undermines the Amazon, and that undermines biodiversity, and they have feedback effects. So they're very, very closely related. The emissions of the carbon dioxide and other gases are responsible for the acidification and the warming of the ocean, which undermines the whole ocean side of biodiversity. So number one is that they're interrelated and similar policies will help. But the second is that it's not quite as simple as that. Overfishing, for example, is about property rights. It's about organization, incentive structures. And that's beyond the idea of in climate change. So we should recognize both the interweaving and that some activities to protect our biodiversity will not be the same as climate. I don't think in competition with it at all, but they would have to be additional. So I think that the biodiversity story is very important. It's not a diversion because of the extent of the overlap. It's not a diversion because of the importance of natural capital in rising living standards or protecting living standards around the world. And we ought to have the bandwidth and the understanding to manage both at the same time without setting one against the other.
Very well. I don't know whether someone else wants to join on this particular topic. We have about 15 minutes, so we may have a few minutes for this, and then I will ask a very quick question at the end. I don't know, Gita, do you want to say something on this issue?
To be clear, I mean, at the IMF, we are currently focused on the climate issues and related issues. So that's where I would say we are concentrated on. But I agree with Nick that, again, I'm no expert on this, but my sense is, especially when you're talking about preserving forests, that there are synergies between the two forms of activity. So, hopefully those are the synergies that we should be exploiting. But I don't have anything more substantial to say on this.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have been discussing since 25 years about sustainable development, and now everything has to be sustainable. Isn't there a risk in using too much this concept, Michael?
So sorry, the question is there a risk?
Is there a risk of using too much the concept of sustainability, and in which put...
Okay. Yeah. So of course, Nick is right, and of course, Gita is right, that the natural environment is you could think of it as have a capital stock for human well-being. And when you just start hearing the numbers of species loss and a variety of other measures, they're very troubling. I think, and this is, a terrible line for an academic to say, but I think this is an area where a lot more research is needed, which is probably something academics think about almost everything. But I think as we kind of move down and make progress on the climate problem, and there'll be great complementarities, no doubt. What's really important, I think what's very important is that we try to help people understand the trade-offs. And there's no getting around that there's going to be trade-offs in confronting the climate challenge or the global energy challenge. And I think having a sense of being able to better quantify what some of the value of the ecosystem services are, I think will make that an easier case to make to people. For instance, there's some very exciting research on the value of bats in the United States, the little animals that fly around and eat insects. But I think we need a lot more of that. And I think without that, there's a risk of appearing tone deaf to the people around the world who are desperate, and there are billions of them, who are desperate for more and less expensive energy.
Thank you very much. I think that we have substantial data gaps, and we have to fill them, and there is obviously a global effort which has to go through the international organizations, and each one of us is contributing. What do you think, Klaas, about that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with previous speakers that the relevance is clearly not less. If you look at these numbers of population sizes of wildlife, for instance, and the species that are threatened with extinction, etc. I also think that there are complementarities and interrelationships, but it is true that in terms of data and analytics, this is still a bit farther behind. And that's, for instance, one reason why also in the financial regulatory community within the FSB, we have decided that we ourselves first focus on climate-related financial risks, but that we welcome very much that the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, actually starts up also more work in the area of biodiversity loss. That the NGFS is a little bit more a laboratory of sort of new ideas and new experiments, But then we hope, of course, in due time, that also within the FSB we can take these risks on board. And as you correctly say, Ignazio, the key is, of course, to get data. And at least on climate, we have now a standardized set of disclosures on which we can sort of hopefully start measure or collect data and measure risks. There's still a lot of data, by the way, that also in the climate-related area that we need to gather. But that is something that needs to happen. A task force on nature-related financial disclosures, that is, I think, very much to be welcomed, because the importance should clearly not be underestimated. Just one piece of data. We have asked, actually, the Dutch financial sector their exposures toward companies that are highly or very highly dependent on ecosystem services. And that was also a number like 510 billion euros only for the Netherlands. So these numbers are potentially also quite mind-boggling, I would say.
Thank you very much. As upcoming chair of the FSB, we count very much on you then. You have a lot of responsibility in trying to somehow give us some answers to these data gaps. But also on these, I'm encouraged by the interest that the private sector has shown in a discussion with the Sustainable Finance Working Group about the nature-related and biodiversity issues that may somehow, once they are properly disclosed in terms of the impact that corporates may have on the society, not only on the economy, may become better priced. So I think there is a lot of work to do, both on research, data, and also on policy. I would conclude, if you indulge me, with one final rapid fire question, which is obviously the one that has to do with the COP26. It's only a few weeks away. What is the one thing you hope to see come out of the meeting to advance the role of finance, which is our own field, clearly in tackling climate change? Why don't we start from Michael, who has been joining late, and he may have some few minutes. Michael.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I'll be looking for that comes out of finance comes from when you look at the projections of where emissions are expected to come from around the world for the rest of the century. And I don't have the right exact number in front of me, but I think, and I'm sure Nick will know this off the top of his head, I think 85% of emissions that are projected for the rest of the century are projected to come from today's developing countries. And the truth is, the trade-off looks very, very stark for them. If you just read the data and you look at their trends in emissions, and so I think what has to come is at least the beginnings of a concrete deal that will enlist the today's developing countries in doing something to reduce their emissions. And I think, they have been trying to avoid that for several COPs, and I understand their perspective. I understand why that's true. And at the end of the day, someone has to pay. And I think the developed countries, the rich countries, should find a way to induce real participation from today's developing countries. Otherwise, the trends are the trends, and I think we're looking at continued future growth in emissions around the planet.
Yes, Gita, what is your point here?
I think Michael hit the nail on the head on the biggest point. I would add, if I may, more than one, but just quickly a couple, which is one, delivering on the 100 billion goal for financing on an annual basis. I think that would be one important piece. Second is, of course, that's not going to be enough, because to get more financing for the kinds of investments that are needed, the scale of investment that's needed, you just need much better harmonization of data standards and common frameworks on that, and also for incorporating climate-related risks into stress testings and financial disclosures. So those would be my broad set of additional targets.
Klaas?
Yeah, there's a lot, of course, to desire for, because it's such a multi-pronged challenge that we are facing. But if you want me to be very concretely, I hope, of course, that a broad international agreement can be reached on mandatory disclosure of climate-related information. We've been working on it very hard. Let's hope that at COP26 we can hammer this one home, an agreement within which also the role of the IFRS, International Sustainability Standards Board, will be recognized, so that one can really be going and rolling. And other than that, if you allow me a small second one, reaffirmation of the importance of carbon pricing, because I'm a little bit concerned with what the current surge in energy pricing is doing to the sort of the willingness of our politicians to spend political capital on carbon pricing. So if we could get a sort of reconfirmation of that importance, that would be my second one. And then I violated my my time here. So thank you for indulging me here.
I'm giving the last word to Nick Stern, who started this debate a few years ago, and maybe tell us what he now expects from COP26.
Expect and hope are different things, but the I'm with Klaas and Gita on the importance of transparency, and with all of us on the importance of carbon pricing. But one thing I would emphasize, same as Michael, and Michael, it's lovely to hear you, if not see you, is low-cost finance on the scale that's necessary. And that 100 billion, I negotiated the 100 billion back in 2009 when I was working with Meles Zenawi, who was speaking for Africa, and Mike Froman, who was working for Hillary Clinton. So it's in my bones, as it were. But it's, as Gita emphasized, it's a small part of the story. We have to deliver it from the point of view of trust. You know, a word was given, a word has to be delivered. But we'll probably do that in 2022 or 2023. We're crawling over the numbers now. But the bigger story is financing those trillions of investment through low-cost finance. We don't want to replace the 100 billion with some other aggregate. We're going to need a lot more bilateral. I would argue tripling by 2025. A lot more multilateral. It's crucial that the MDBs expand their ability to lend, and the shareholders behind them. If that's used in the right way, the private sector multipliers could be much bigger than now, with much stronger focus on the management, sharing, reducing of risk. And fourth dimension would be voluntary carbon markets. They could be really pretty high now. And Michael rightly emphasized the voluntary part of the story that many people and firms want to cut and pay for the cutting of emissions. Those voluntary carbon markets could be very substantial, and I hope that we'll make progress on that. So the story will be to look at the numbers. Gita gave them, I gave them, we're roughly in the same ballpark, and look now at the specifics of how to finance it in nature and in scale. And I think we can do that, and I'm hoping for a step forward at COP26 on exactly that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Gita. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Klaas. Thank you, Nick. This has been really an excellent conversation, very interesting. And really the issue that at the end Nick pointed out about trust, I think is crucial. We need to build trust. We had this pandemic that made even physical meetings very difficult. We are starting to meet again in presence, and it's extremely fruitful. We have a difficulty with China. We hope really that China opens again, and even physically, and so we can meet and really start discussing these things at length. It's not easy. I think politicians, the willing politicians, have to act. I'm counting on Mario on this, as he has now the presidency of the G20 that will meet at the end of the month, but obviously COP26 will be crucial, and the British are really to play a major role there. So thank you very much, all of you, all the participants here in person in Milan and all of those who are connected remotely for this very fruitful exchange of views we have had today. And I'm glad now to conclude today's discussion saying a few words concluding the conference, a few remarks. I just put them down now. We are at the end of this conference, which has been interesting. And I'd like first to thank all the speakers, the chairs, who gave us important insights on the economic implications of climate change in these 2 days, and on the transition specifically to a net zero world. I would also like to thank the colleagues of our staff, both here and in Rome, where this has been organized, the help from the Bank of England side, the Milan branch, who have made the organization of this event possible. The remarks I'd like to make are very few. The main takeaways of the conference, which I see, are the following ones. We had plenty of evidence that climate change poses both physical and transition risk, with impacts on the economy and the financial markets, which are substantial. And also, I would emphasize this non-linear. The non-linear part of that is crucial. This has come out in the discussion. There is a need for more and better information. And this has also been a topic which has been emphasized in the panel, as well as an enhanced research effort to develop analytical tools to integrate climate change scenarios, the NGFS ones, for example, that have been mentioned, with the macroeconomic modeling, the analysis, as well as financial modeling. And the financial modeling that was emphasized by Monika Piazzesi is interesting. We will consider that in our monetary policy discussion, even if some of us may not feel being so extreme in what has been put forward. The important thing is that all this is useful and I would say essential, indispensable instrument for assessing the economic, the social and the environmental costs of not acting. The second point which I take is that the academics have showed us that while technological innovation is key to achieve a net zero economy, policies and incentives for the private sector to innovate are still largely insufficient. There is more financing needed. It has to come from the public sector. 1/3 is what Gita mentioned. The other 2/3 we have to come up with ways of having the private sector really being convinced that this is absolutely necessary. And indeed, estimates suggest that green innovation has been somewhat declining in recent years. So we need investment. Optimal climate policy requires both carbon pricing and public incentives for innovation. There has been, as I was mentioning, some research that suggests that monetary policy interventions might unintentionally benefit high carbon activities, reducing the relative cost of capital. However, how monetary operations could help to tackle climate change is still a debated issue. What is sure is the importance for central banks of integrating the impact of climate change in our financial and economic analysis. From the conference sessions as well as from the discussion in the panel, I think a main unitary view on the urgency to act to combat climate change has emerged. We have learned that climate change is seriously damaging our economies and that its effects will increase in the next few years. They will increase dramatically indeed if temperatures overshoot the 2%, the 1 to 2% Celsius thresholds. On the other hand, we understand very well by now that decarbonization has net benefits. It is a complex process, one that requires policy clarity and finance to help accelerate the transformation towards carbon neutrality, but one that we absolutely have to pursue. And it is clearly a particularly challenging process, as Gita and also Nick have mentioned, in low and middle income economies. The 100 billion is there to be used. It has to be used. Moral hazard is a minor issue here. We really have to make a major effort And as Nika said, then I think the economies of scale will be there, and therefore there will be a probably virtuous circle rather than going back to a more conservative view. The challenge indeed is really global. It follows that international cooperation, under many respects coordination, are absolutely necessary. And this is why so much attention and time are devoted to this issue, and why we look with high expectations and, as been mentioned, some trepidation to the upcoming COP26 conference in Glasgow. Well, I indeed hope that this event has contributed to inform a more effective global coordinated action. I wish again to thank you all and say you all arrivederci. Bye-bye then. Thank you. Bye.
Arrivederci e grazie.
Bye-bye then. Ciao.
Well, thank you very much. This is the end, and thank you for being in Milan. I hope that it has been a pleasant experience, and to see you again soon here at the Milan Regional Branch for going on to discuss, to provide good research and new research. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the people who have contributed to make this conference, I hope, a success. Thank you very much.
Grazie.